Millions of people in Africa are at risk of starvation and famine. And while famine is not entirely a land reform issue, governments can propose reforms as a significant part in the solution. My colleague, Paul Sisco, has more.
Land reform. Land reform involves the changing of laws, regulations, or customs regarding land ownership. Land reform may consist of a government-initiated or government-backed property redistribution, generally of agricultural lands. Access to land, ownership of land, is an increasing problem in Africa, the result of population growth and tenure reforms. Land tenure refers to the political, economic, social, and legal structures that determined land management and ownership. In Uganda, the issue of land ownership is literally one of life and death, according to one chief. President Yoweri Museveni wants to abandon traditional land ownership rights by introducing a more modern national system with more land under government control and regulation. This month, South African President Jacob Zuma called for constitutional changes and land reform policies that could alter ownership, moving it from corporate and mostly white entities to the South African government without compensation. Zuma won support for the so-called willing seller, willing buyer land reform policy in the 1990s. But by the government's own account, that and most of South Africa's land reform projects have failed to make ownership more equitable. Land governorship remains a huge issue in Zimbabwe, where President Robert Mugabe has been in power since 1980. Analysts disagree as to whether or not the seizure of land from white farmers in 2000 has been a significant factor in Zimbabwe's subsequent and continuing economic decline. Calls for land reform are popular, but decades of talk and reforms tried and even adopted have brought few, if any, recognizable benefits for generations of Africans and their families. The 18th Annual Land and Poverty Conference is underway this week at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., with experts and interested parties discussing much-needed recommendations, reforms, and governance issues aimed at making land ownership more equitable and farms and fields more productive. In fact, more and more African families are entirely landless. Ugandan women provide 80% of the work and own 7% of the land. Worldwide, there is an accelerating movement of people from rural regions to urban centers that has been underway for more than 50 years. City dwellers need jobs, of course, and food, and a place to live. Many experts believe the day of the subsistence farmer will soon be gone. Worldwide, commercial farming is on the increase. Investing in land ownership is limited because of the insecurity of those investments, particularly in Africa. Sufficient fertile agricultural lands exist in Africa to feed the continent and export food to much of the world. Ethiopia fed peoples across the Horn of Africa and beyond. But insecurity, poor governance, corruption, and the absence of equitably established land reform policies are part of the problem and significant factors contributing to what the United Nations says may be the greatest humanitarian crisis since 1945. The looming starvation of more than 20 million people in Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East. Paul Sisco, VOA News, Washington.